This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for December 18th through the 24th. On this week's show, we discuss how the most famous piece of classical music didn't have such a revered beginning. Plus, in honor of my birthday on December 21st, we discuss two events that happened that date, one extremely tragic and the other extremely strange, along with a history-making Christmas song. Sometimes in entertainment, projects that don't start out too well end up becoming classics, especially in movies. Think the original Blade Runner, for instance, which made no money initially, but is considered now to be one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made. The same happens in music, where a song that either failed on the charts or didn't even get released as a single turns into a classic on its own. Think most of Led Zeppelin's music, for instance, which weren't released as singles but are still considered classics, like pretty much every single song. The same thing happened to what is considered the greatest piece of classical music ever written, which started out pretty roughly, actually. And in the end, it owes its longevity to, of all people, a music critic. See, back in the early 1800s, Vienna, Austria was going through some pretty tough times. The Napoleonic Wars were going on, and Vienna suddenly found itself occupied by Napoleon's troops. One of those who found himself under occupation was composer extraordinaire Mr. Ludwig van Beethoven. He also found himself with a more personal dilemma. He was going deaf. Time was of the essence, so off he went on a creative binge of binges. He wrote a few symphonies and numerous concertos, bouncing back and forth between them all in a masterful piece of multitasking. He decided to do a concert with all of his new works on December 22nd, 1808. He rehearsed with an orchestra only once, which became a problem at the concert, as you will see. It turned out that was one of many problems that evening. The first problem was that the place of the performance, the Theater an der Wien, was cold. Another problem was the length of the show. With 8 pieces premiering that night, the concert clocked in at over 4 hours, or roughly about the same time as a Bruce Springsteen encore. Add to all of that a cranky, cold audience in a very cold theater and an orchestra that you only practice once with, and things are going to be, let's say, interesting at best. In fact, at one point, Beethoven had to stop the performance and start again because the orchestra was playing so poorly. Initial reaction to the concert was, meh. After all, if you had to sit through a 4-hour concert in a cold theater with a sucky orchestra, you wouldn't exactly be too thrilled about the experience either. Things changed in 1810, though, when Beethoven's manuscripts of the music were released. It was at this time that a leading music critic got a hold of the manuscript and bestowed heap upon heap of praise to the music. Critic E.T.A. Hoffman said, quote, "Radiant beams shoot through this region's deep night, and we become aware of the gigantic shadows which, rocking back and forth, close in on us and destroy everything within us except the pain of endless longing, a longing in which every pleasure that rose up in jubilant tones sinks and succumbs, and only through this pain, which, while consuming but not destroying love, hope, and joy, tries to burst our breasts with full-voiced harmonies of all the passions, we live on and are captivated beholders of the spirits." End quote. All right, perhaps this was a bit on the overkill side, but hey, got the job done. Soon, the piece, with its 4 dominant opening notes, ba 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 ba, started getting played by orchestras everywhere. Over a century later, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, that is, used those 4 notes as the opening to its broadcast because those notes came pretty close to being Morse code for victory. Even artist Walter Murphy took the piece, gave it a disco beat, and turned it into a #1 single on the pop charts. I'm pretty sure Beethoven was rolling in his grave on that one. The most famous piece of classical music ever with those 4 notes, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, premiered on December 22nd, 1808. Before we go any further, we'd like to tell you about our other podcasts. The Music History Today podcast goes over the daily events in music history and drops daily, including weekends, on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. There's also the Music Halls of Fame podcast, which talks about a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, along with other Music Halls of Fame's museums and walks of fame. The Music Halls of Fame podcast drops every Thursday and can also be found on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to this podcast. And now to the 3 events that happened on December 21st, which happens to also be my birthday. Happy birthday to me. First off, one day, members of the group The Four Tops overslept after staying up all night for a recording session. Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols' wife, Nora, took too long packing for a trip. Paul Jeffries of Steve Harley and the Cockney Rebel had gotten married and was going on his honeymoon with his wife. All of them had a plane to catch. The same plane, as a matter of fact. The Four Tops and Johnny Rotten and his wife all missed the flight. Paul Jeffries made it. All of them would be affected by the events of that particular flight. On December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 was to run its normal everyday route from Frankfurt, Germany to Detroit, Michigan, making stops in London, England, and New York City. The plane made the Frankfurt to London run without incident. In London, it took on passengers and luggage. At 6:04 p.m. local time, it left the terminal. At 6:25, it was wheels up off the runway and heading to New York City. At 7:02, it was at 31,000 feet. Air traffic control transmitted clearance to go over the ocean. There was no response. On the radar screen, what was one blip on the radar suddenly became 5. Pan Am Flight 103 had exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 259 people on board, including Paul Jeffries and his new wife, along with 35 Syracuse University students who were going back to the United States after studying in the United Kingdom for a semester. Also killed were 11 people on the ground when the pieces of the plane rained down on the peaceful village of Lockerbie in the early evening. A 3-year investigation showed that 2 Libyan agents placed a bomb made from the plastic explosive Semtex into a cassette player with a timer and then put it all into a suitcase. The suitcase was placed on a plane in Malta, where it was then transferred to Flight 103 in Frankfurt. There were warnings that this was going to happen. 2 weeks before the bombing, a man called the American Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, and said that people associated with the Abu Nidal organization were going to blow up a Pan Am flight from Frankfurt to New York City within the next 2 weeks. While the warning was taken seriously by the United States government along with the embassies, the airline let it slip through. In fact, the day after the bombing, the alert for this whole event was found at the airline security desk under a pile of papers. The bombing of the plane was done on orders from then Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi. For a number of years, he denied personal involvement. Both of the agents were handed over to Scottish authorities in 1999. One of the agents, a guy by the name of Abdel Basset al-Magrahi, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but was released in 2009 on compassionate release grounds because he had prostate cancer. He died from the disease in 2012. The other agent, Lahim Khalifa Fhimah, was found not guilty. In 2020, American authorities found and arrested the bomb maker, Abu Aguila Mohammed Masood Khair al-Marimi. His trial is scheduled to start in 2025. There were, as always, a number of organizations claiming responsibility, along with a group of people spreading conspiracy theories, because that's nothing new. One person claimed that the group the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution were responsible. Another one said that the group the Islamic Jihad organization was responsible, and still another claimed that the Israeli intelligence organization Mossad was behind it all. Another person blamed Iran. What was not figured out was why the plane was brought down by the Libyans in the first place, although there is some thought that it was somehow connected to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Council. Eventually, Gaddafi accepted responsibility for the attack in exchange for getting sanctions lifted that were hurting his country's economy. Unfortunately for him, he only got to enjoy those sanctions being lifted for a couple of years. When civil war broke out in Libya, Gaddafi tried to escape. Also unfortunately for him, joint Allied coalition forces were watching his vehicles from the air, poetic justice, and, quote-unquote, accidentally dropped a few bombs on his vehicles to impede his escape. Accidentally. He was taken dazed from his destroyed vehicle. He was then beaten up by his own people, and much like strongmen and dictators before him, was eventually murdered by his own people. A fitting end for the person who ordered the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, which exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, with Paul Jeffries of Steve Harley and the Cockney Rebel on board, and that almost had Johnny Rotten, his wife, and the Four Tops on board as well on December 21st, 1988. In 1970, a man who went by the name of John Burroughs handed a handwritten letter to White House guards requesting a visit with the President of the United States. Within a few days, he was granted that visit. The whole thing started a few days earlier when John's wife got upset with him for spending over $100,000 on 32 handguns and 10 Mercedes. John decided to get on the next available plane out of town and headed west to Los Angeles because pretty sure his wife was not exactly too thrilled to have him around at that point. While John was bored out of his mind in Los Angeles, and I don't get how, because, L.A., movie stars, you got the money, you go hang out with the stars. In any event, John was bored. He had a crazy idea. See, John was a bit of a collector, and what he loved to collect were law enforcement badges. There was one badge for what he really wanted to get, a Drug Enforcement Agency badge, or as it was called back in those times, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. John figured that with the badge, he could go anywhere he wanted and bring his gun collection and drugs with him because John also had a bit of a drug problem. Idle hands being the devil's playthings, what was John to do but to try and get a badge from, of all people, the President of the United States? John got back on a plane and traveled to Washington, D.C. He wrote his note saying that he wanted to help with the anti-drug and counterculture wars that the president was waging at that time. And then he and one of his assistants delivered the note to the White House guards to give to the president. He included the name he was staying under at the hotel and how long he'd be in town for. And then He waited. As it turns out, the note made its way to one of the president's aides, who was a huge fan of John's. A meeting was set up for December 21st, 1970 in the morning. John and his assistants went to the White House, where John was going to give the president a Colt .45 pistol as a gift. The gun was confiscated, of course. Then John went into the Oval Office without the buddies, at first at least. There, the president met John for the first time. John and the president had a good talk and had a lot of photos taken. One of those photos of the two of them shaking hands is one of the most requested photos in the National Archives that you can actually purchase. John spoke about his disdain for the counterculture and the Beatles, calling them anti-Americans, to which the president agreed, and seeing as how the Beatles were British, that would sort of... Anyway, why have logic get thrown in on this? In any event, John then asked for his narcotics badge, to which the president agreed to give it to him. John was allowed to bring his entourage in to meet the president, where they all received White House brooches and cufflinks. During lunch in the White House later on, John was presented with his very own narcotics badge. Now, you may be wondering if there was any recording of this meeting other than a few photos. The answer is no. See, at the time, the president, Richard M. Nixon, did not have his famous recording machine installed. That very same recording machine that helped to take down his presidency only 4 years later. As for John, the irony is that he hated the counterculture because they took drugs, while drugs took his life 7 years after this meeting while dealing with another oval, the one that was his toilet at Graceland. For you see, John Burroughs was the name that Elvis Presley used when he stayed in hotels in order to avoid the fans. When John Burroughs, a.k.a. Elvis Presley, complete with a purple jumpsuit, met President Richard M. Nixon at the White House, December 21st, 1970. This third event that happened on December 21st concerns a woman who made music history. The holiday season has its share of good music. Hell, it wouldn't be the holiday season without good music. It sets the mood for dealing with your racist relatives and wondering why you didn't get the gift that you really wanted, even though anybody bothered to give you a gift at all. Cheap bastards. But enough about me. I digress. In terms of Christmas music, though, there's plenty of different types of songs to choose from. You can go with the classical religious route, like something, say, Handel's Messiah. Maybe some choral religious stuff, like, say, Silent Night. You could go the pop rock route with songs like Run, Run, Rudolph, Little Saint Nick, I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, Happy Christmas War is Over, Last Christmas, Blue Christmas, Wonderful Christmas Time, Step Into Christmas. You can even go the charity Christmas route with Band-Aid's Do They Know It's Christmas. In the past 30 years or so, though, there haven't really been that many modern-day Christmas songs that have endured. There's NSYNC's Merry Christmas, I suppose. There's Wham's Last Christmas, which really isn't a Christmas song, mind you. It's actually about a breakup, if anyone even listened to the actual lyrics. It's about as much of a Christmas song as Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and Trading Places are Christmas movies. Yes, I know there are people who are going to say that Die Hard is a Christmas movie. It is not. Stop it. In any event, they only take place during Christmas. People, again, I digress. The point is that while there have been a bunch of artists who have put out Christmas albums, there haven't been many Christmas songs that have become modern-day Christmas standards in the last 30, 40 years or so. This next one, though, is probably the biggest modern-day Christmas song classic since, let's say, the 1990s. First, let's give this a little bit of a backstory. Back in 1988, Mariah Carey was just an aspiring singer with an amazing voice. What Mariah also had was a friend named Brenda K. Starr, who was an up-and-coming singer and had a few hits of her own at that time. Legend has it that Brenda invited Mariah to accompany her to a Columbia Records party in December of 1988. Mariah went along and brought along a demo tape that she was working on. While at the party, she met Columbia Records head Tommy Mottola. She handed him her tape, but didn't hand him her business card for some reason or other. Tommy decided to listen to the tape on the way home from the party. After listening to the tape, he was interested in signing her to a record deal, but couldn't find her for 2 weeks to get her to sign. Remember, kids, this was 1988. No internet, no Google. Surprise, Tommy just didn't call up Brenda K. Starr and ask her who her friend at the party was, but I guess that doesn't make for as good a story. Anyway, Mariah signed her record deal with Columbia Records and recorded her first album, self-titled, of course, Mariah Carey. Her debut live performance was on the Arsenio Hall Show, which was just becoming the most talked about late-night talk show at that time. After a couple of months of getting weak sales, the album suddenly exploded and became a huge hit. It spawned the singles Vision of Love, Someday, I Don't Want to Cry, and Love Takes Time. Both the album and all 4 of those songs hit number 1. She also won 2 Grammy Awards, including one for Best New Artist. She followed that album up with 2 things. The first was a new album called Emotions. That album had the single Emotion, and while it sold well, it didn't sell as well as her debut album and thus was considered a failure by some people's standards anyway. Something else also happened around this time. Tommy and Mariah had fallen in love and had gotten married. After Emotion, Mariah did an MTV Unplugged show and released the concert as its own album. That album did pretty well and was sort of considered a quote-unquote comeback, even though she hadn't fallen off that much. In any event, the album featured Mariah's version of the Jackson 5's hit I'll Be There, and her version also went top 10. In 1992, Mariah got to work on her 3rd studio album, Music Box. Around the time of recording, the storybook marriage of Tommy and Mariah had turned into a nightmare and the cracks were beginning to show. Musically, Mariah wanted a more urban sound for this album. She still did the ballads that she was known for, but she put some more dance tracks onto this one. On August 31st, 1993, the album Music Box was released. That album had hit songs Dream Lover, Hero, and Without You. Music Box was number 1 in 16 different countries, including America, was the 2nd biggest album of 1993, the 124th biggest album of 1994, and was the 26th biggest album of the 1990s. All of that while getting some less than favorable critical reviews. These 4 albums laid the foundation for the rest of her career, solidifying her place in music history already by that time. The rest of the 1990s, though, were pretty successful, with more hit albums and singles, including the number 1 single, One Sweet Day, with Boyz II Men, which held the record along with Daddy Yankee and Luis Fonsi's Despacito for the longest consecutive streak on the top of Billboard singles charts, with 16 straight weeks at number 1. At least until Lil Nas X and Billy Ray Cyrus blew it all away with Old Town Road, and now Shaboozey with a bar song Tipsy. They are at somewhere around 19 weeks, I believe, is the new record. Then something happened. Starting at the beginning of the 21st century, Mariah suddenly became unpopular. It all started when she acted in and made the soundtrack for the 2001 movie Glitter. Both her performance and the soundtrack were universally panned. Her 2002 follow-up, Charm Bracelet, fared no better. She had other issues as well, including a failed public romance and a very public mental health issue that the press wrongly made fun of. A lot of people in the music and tabloid media began to think that Mariah's career was finished, a relic of the 1990s along with flannel shirts, CDs, and, well, Bill Clinton. Once she sought treatment for her mental health issues, she got back to work on her next album, The Emancipation of Mimi. The most successful song on it was written by Mariah, Jermaine Dupri, and Jonta Austin. Other songwriting credits were given, as the production team also took samples from Bobby Womack's If You Think You're Lonely Now and The Deal's Two Occasions. That particular song, We Belong Together, was released on March 29, 2005 and became a smash hit. Not only did it hit number 1 on the Billboard Singles Chart, it became the first single to hold the top spot on 9 different Billboard Singles Chart in the same exact week. It also spent 14 weeks at number 1, a record now eclipsed by 5 other songs, including One Sweet Day and, as we mentioned before, Lil Nas X and Shaboozey. Let's go backwards a little bit, though, now to 1994. During the beginning of the end of her first marriage, Mariah put out a Christmas album. Merry Christmas was released on October 28, 1994. On this album, you will find, of course, our history-making song. All I Want for Christmas Is You was written and produced by Mariah and Walter Afanasieff and was recorded at the Hit Factory Music Studio in New York City in August of 1994. The song almost didn't come about, as Mariah was just beginning to hit her stride in the music industry, and putting out a Christmas album was thought to be something you did when your career was on its way down, not when you were on your way up. What was thought of as fact was actually a golden opportunity, because not many artists put out Christmas albums back during that time period. It had basically fallen out of favor, sort of like Westerns at one point. Mariah and Walter went to work writing songs. They wanted an upbeat song to go along with the more traditional Christmas music. They originally recorded the song with live drums and other instruments, but hated it and reworked the song. All I Want for Christmas Is You was released on the same day as the Merry Christmas album, but only as a music video and a radio single. It was not released as a record or CD single at that time. During the first year on the charts, it did very well on the singles chart in America, going to number 12 and to number 6 on the Hot Adult Contemporary chart. Same thing happened worldwide. As the years went on, the festive tune became something of a cult Christmas classics, always doing well from November to early January, when people finally get sick of Christmas music, I guess. Yet, as popular as this song was for over 25 years, Billboard magazine chart rules regulated Christmas songs to the holiday music chart and kept holiday songs off of the Hot 100 Pop Singles chart, denying All I Want for Christmas Is You a crack at getting to number 1 on the singles chart. In 2019, that all changed. Late in 2019, Billboard magazine finally allowed holiday music to be included with pop music for its Hot 100 singles chart. And on December 21st, 2019, 25 years after consistently being on the charts every holiday season, All I Want for Christmas Is You finally hit number 1 on the Billboard singles chart. That particular day, many records were broken, including the longest climb to number 1 at 25 years. Because the Christmas songs stopped being counted after the first week of January the very next year, the song broke another record when it was also number 1 during the first week in January of 2020. It became the last number 1 of the 2010s and the first number 1 of the 2020s, making Mariah Carey the first artist to have a number 1 song in 4 different decades, from the early 1990s to the 2020s. And yes, it took Billboard changing their rules in order to get Mariah her only number one single of the last decade, but hey, a number one single is still a number one single. Mariah Carey's contemporary Christmas standard, All I Want for Christmas Is You, broke records when it hit number one on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart on December 21st, 2019. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for December 18th through the 24th. Everyone have a safe and hopefully happy holiday season, and we will be back next week for the Christmas and New Year's Eve edition. Thank you very, very much for listening and or watching if you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify.